Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining today. My name is Vanessa, and today I will be presenting on 7 secrets to completing a dissertation in 1 year. Just before we get started, I just want to make sure, can everybody see my screen and hear me? Yes. All right, great. So we'll go ahead and get started. Today, a lot of what I'm going to talk about are some of the logistics of the dissertation. So, in addition to writing some of the back end stuff that you should be aware of and kind of be planning towards. So we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so the very first thing that should be considered when you're starting your dissertation is really developing those research questions and hypotheses. The research questions for your paper are going to set up the methodological approach, the theoretical constructs, also the participant and sampling frame, and your data collection procedures. So everything really stems from those initial research questions. So just be aware that, this is really the foundation of the study. They can change throughout the process from, the very beginning, from the proposal phase through to when you're defending. They may change, but it's important to just try to really establish detailed and specific research questions at the very beginning. To do this, I recommend that you take a deep dive into the literature, and I will talk about the literature search throughout this presentation, but really take a deep dive into the literature to see what has been done with regards to the specific variables that you're interested in studying, or the specific population that you're interested in studying. So you want to know what has been done, what are the gaps in the literature, and try to develop research questions that are going to generate maybe novel ideas or novel approaches to those particular variables. So these research questions shouldn't just be something that you are curious about or interested in. They should really be grounded in the literature and what is needed in that particular area. Now, once you have developed your research questions, and actually, I'm going to talk a little bit more about research questions. In addition to developing them, you want to think about the way to phrase them. So when you are doing a quantitative study versus a qualitative study, there's different language that is used around research questions. So for example, in qualitative studies, you're going to be looking at participants' perceptions, ideas, feelings. So the language that encodes those research questions is very different from a quantitative study. So you may say something in a qualitative study like explore the perceptions or develop a theory, something like that. Whereas in a quantitative study, you may be saying things that are more related to really quantifying results. So you might say something like, understand the associations of heart disease and obesity, right? So in a qualitative study, you wouldn't really be looking at associations. That's more of a statistical term, whereas in a quantitative study, you would. So when you're doing your literature search, also be aware of the language that they're using for those research questions to make sure that you are using language that makes sense for the type of study that you're going to do. The type of study that you ultimately end up doing will be based on these questions. So if after your literature search, you decide you want to understand perceptions, then that is an indicator that you will most likely do a qualitative study. Whereas if you're really wanting to test hypotheses or look at different scores between two groups, that type of language in the research question is going to put you down like a quantitative path. So just be aware of that also when you're starting to put this research question together. If you have an idea of the type of study you want to do, or if you're kind of starting fresh. So once you do that, then you'll begin to establish that timeline and methodology. So a large part of this dissertation is going to be your time management. It's a long process in your life. You're working on this for multiple semesters. And it's going to be important to set yourself up with some expectations for your time. So long-term and short-term. That means that you may want to plan out what months you're going to start drafting, what months you're going to be developing the research questions, anticipating how long it's going to take to work with your reviewers to get feedback. So you may want to have a long, maybe year-long or 2-year-long, depending on, the nature of your work, timeline of when you plan to do things. So step 1 might be conduct a literature search. Step 2 might be develop research questions. How much time do you think it's going to take you to do each of those things? And go ahead and plan that out on a long timeline so that you can see kind of into the future of how long your study is going to take. In that, you're going to incorporate your methodology. So depending on the type of study you're doing, you may need to collect primary data. So maybe you are doing your own quantitative or qualitative or mixed method study, and you need to actually recruit participants. That activity should be built into that timeline. So how long are you hoping to recruit participants for? A month, 2 months, how long is that data collection going to take place? Be sure to build that in. Now, if you're not doing a study that requires primary data, maybe you're doing a secondary analysis, what is the expectation for gaining access to the data set that you plan on analyzing? If it's data that belongs to your mentor and they can just email it over to you, great. Then maybe it's going to be a very short process to gain access to the data. But if you're using maybe a government data set like maybe like the pregnancy risk monitoring data set from the CDC, there may be a turnaround time to get that. So typically you might need to submit a formal proposal for the data or request for the data, and they'll review it in like 4 to 6 months or whatever it is for the particular institution that you're using. So build that into the timeline. That way, you can still graduate on time, or you can make adjustments as needed based on what you're working with. So that is kind of the time piece of it. In addition to the time, you need to build out a step-by-step list of your methodology. So when you go to write your methods chapter in the dissertation, the goal of that chapter is that it's reproducible. So somebody else should be able to come after you, read your methods, and conduct the research in the same way that you have. In order to do that, you really need to sit down and create a bulleted list. So what is the absolute first thing that needs to be done in order to achieve your study? It's most likely going to be your IRB approval from your institution. So I recommend, kind of creating the bulleted list, then using that bulleted list to submit your IRB approval. So first, you're going to want to seek out IRB approval. So you're going to need to list out what are the procedures for your study. How are you going to conduct your participant recruitment? Where are you going to recruit participants from? Kind of the nitty-gritty things that you think might be intuitive, but they really do need to be included. So once you do reach out to participants, how are they getting in touch with you to become engaged with your research? Then you'll want to talk about the informed consent process. Any instrumentation that's going to be used in the study. So are you using surveys? Are you using a qualitative research guide? Are you using maybe body measurements like weight, height, things like that? And I see a question in the chat. IRB is the Institutional Review Board. So typically, if you're doing a study that is going to include humans, you'll need to fill out kind of an IRB to show that your study is ethical and you're going through like the proper channels to conduct your study. So you just want to be really clear here in what you're doing. So it might look like I'm going to be conducting a study to understand teachers' perceptions of teaching during COVID-19. So in order to do that, I'm going to request permission from a local school to interview their teachers. So that's step 1. What are the permissions you need? I need to get permission from the school to recruit teachers in their district. Next, I'm going to distribute a recruitment flyer so that participants or potential participants can become aware of my study. That might be my second bullet. Bullet 3, once participants become aware of the study, they'll have access to my email through the flyer to become engaged in the study. Next bullet, after they become engaged, I will send them an informed consent and pre-screening survey to ensure that they are the correct, they meet the criteria to participate. So kind of that step-by-step process of how are you getting the participants, how are you getting them engaged, and then after that, what's next for the actual data collection. So once participants have completed their informed consent, I will invite them to complete a 60-minute qualitative interview. And that's kind of the end of that methodology, right? So those are all of the study procedures that are going to go in. So I recommend creating a bulleted list first, and then you can use that list in your writing later on. You can turn it into a narrative and just build some narrative around it. And then you have your methodology chapter. But again, having that list will help you with your overall timeline. Also, when you're thinking about the timeline, think about how long it's going to take you to actually write. Some of the data collection may be a little bit easier to anticipate, right? Like, okay, I'm going to conduct 10 interviews over 1 month. That might be a little bit easier, but it may be difficult to anticipate how long it's going to take you to write an introduction chapter or your results chapter. So set goals for yourself on when you would like to have them done, knowing that things might change, but kind of just try to have that scheduled. And once you create that timeline, go into your personal calendar and schedule blocks of time to write. It is so easy for, if you don't schedule that time, to have a week go by where maybe you're not writing or you don't pick up your dissertation. So really make sure to be intentional in the way that you add that to your calendars. Try to have protected time where you are just working on the dissertation or, pieces of the dissertation. I know a lot of times when we sit down to write, it can be difficult to get started. So my advice there would be just, have a daily goal where you're committing to writing a piece. You don't need to sit down and bang out a full chapter, but maybe you can set aside an hour or 2 hours to create like a demographics table. So think about kind of those more digestible pieces within the dissertation that you can slot time for, as opposed to trying to sit down and write 2-3 chapters in one day. So the next piece that kind of goes along with this timeline is being able to anticipate any challenges that you're going to have along the way, whether that's related to participant recruitment or just other pieces of the dissertation. So when you're doing this, you want to very early consider what roadblocks might pop up with regards to participant recruitment. So for example, in the example I gave in the last slide, conducting a study of teachers' perceptions on COVID-19, a roadblock that you might run into is you might go to that first school district and they will not give you permission to recruit teachers at their school. So you want to have some contingency plans in place. If a particular site won't allow you to recruit there, what can you do to pivot to still collect the data that you need? It could mean that you're going to change the site of your study. So maybe instead of recruiting directly at a school, maybe you're going to post in like a Facebook group or a LinkedIn group where teachers are, so maybe you're going to reach out to those participants a different way. Or maybe instead of collecting primary data, you're going to rely on a data set that has the information that you're looking for. So just think of some, plan B, plan C of how you're going to collect the data you need if something pops up. And then you'll also want to think about, for those, second and third plans, what are the potential implications when submitting your proposal to the IRB? depending on what comes up. So particularly if you're planning to work with vulnerable populations, so children, pregnant women, potentially incarcerated people, depending on who your study sample is, think about what the IRB might come back with and how you can address any concerns that they might have if you are working with vulnerable populations. And again, it's so important to be thinking about this early because this is going to affect the timeline of your study. So kind of having that foresight of what questions might someone have about me working with this population, and how can I mitigate any any challenging opinions on that side, and how can I provide information on the front end to ensure that any concerns about working with that population are addressed so that I can move forward, as opposed to kind of getting in a cycle. And the reason that this is important is because your institutional review board is going to give you permission to recruit for your study. So in order to move forward, you really do need that okay. So you kind of just want to be thinking beforehand. Okay. And then in addition to that, you should talk to people that are in your department. They may have ideas for participant recruitment. More than likely, you have some researchers in your department that may have consent to contact lists. So maybe they've conducted a study in the past, and as a part of that study, they had participants consent to be contacted for future research. That may be a great pool, depending on what you are studying, of people that you can start inviting to participate in your study. So kind of think about the resources that may be available within your network to identify potential participants as well. I would say recruiting participants tends to be a large time chunk for people, where they're trying to figure out how they're going to recruit them, and then having to, do that active recruitment where you're calling people, screening people, emailing people. So this is a process that you really want to think about all of the resources that you have at your disposal, and ways that you may be able to cut down some of that time suck by really identifying people that may be available / in your network. Next, I recommend that you refer to any resources that your library has, and also citation management tools. I think a good reference librarian is worth their weight in gold. They can be helpful to identify relevant articles and to help you learn how to summarize peer-reviewed articles for your literature review. And also they can help you examine them closely to kind of determine and develop those research questions. So a reference librarian can be a really helpful tool. They can also help you with developing mesh terms. So if you are conducting your literature search and you just want to make sure you're casting a wide enough net that you are capturing all of the literature in your particular area, they can help you really hone that search so that you're being intentional and you're not just kind of looking at every single paper that has maybe a particular keyword, but really thinking of those intentional keywords that are going to pull down the literature that's been done on your topic of interest. This is also going to be very helpful as you write. So the best thing that you can do when you're preparing for the dissertation is read articles about the methodology that you're interested in, the variables that you're interested in. In order to really continue moving forward, you are just going to have that base knowledge and background knowledge of your topic of interest. It's going to help you kind of know what's been done, know what the gaps in the literature are, and also it's going to help you formulate ideas and opinions around these topics, right? So when we get to the discussion chapter, a lot of that is going to be thinking about the future implications of the research. So in order to do that, you need to have a good background knowledge of what's already been done and what's needed. So I definitely recommend using those resources, whether it's the librarian or just your school library's website. That can help you get past the paywall sometimes for articles. So you may find an article through a Google Scholar search, and then you go and they want you to pay a membership fee to read the article. Sometimes your school library will override that fee, because typically schools will cover that with your student ID or your institutional login. So then when you are doing your literature search, it's important not to just read it and forget it, right? You don't have to memorize everything, you don't have to know everything, but it is important to document what you've found. So for that, I recommend creating a table of evidence. The way that I like to do it is I open up an Excel sheet and I have a column for the title of the article, the author, potentially the year that it was published, and then I write the variables that were used, the way that the variables were defined. So really, what are those operational definitions for the variables? Any key findings, the methodology that was used, and then I have a column for like my thoughts and ideas about that particular article, or other ways that I think that they could have done things, or how I might incorporate it into my own research. So again, you don't have to memorize, but have that Excel table prepared for yourself, so that when you're stuck or when you're thinking, you can refer back to it and really kind of have a snapshot of the literature. And then another thing that I find helpful is just those citation management tools. I love Zotero. That is the one that I use for my own work. If you're not familiar with citation management tools, they are very helpful to keep track of the articles and the books that you're reading. And they also work well with Microsoft Word to actually automatically put in your in-text citations and create your bibliography. So I think a lot of times I see, or for myself and others, before using these tools, I would have kind of this massive Excel document of articles that I liked or that I found interesting. And it just wasn't the most effective way to write, because it's like you're having to go back to the website and format the citation, and it takes time away from other things that you can be doing. So using a citation management tool is going to cut down on some of that time. It's going to format the citations for you. So I highly recommend, and at the end here, if anybody's interested, I can show you how that works. Next, I recommend really getting organized with your reviewers. So this is one that I think should be done early on in the process. Your reviewers are going to read through most likely each chapter, or at least the full proposal or full defense document that you send them. And in the process, you are going to have to go through rounds of sending them your work, waiting for their feedback, revising based on their feedback, and kind of going around in that cycle. It's important to be conscious of that when you are creating that initial timeline. You may have reviewers that take 1 week to review a document. You may have reviewers that take a month to review a document. So it's important to set early expectations with those reviewers, have a discussion with them on your tentative timeline, your goals for graduation. When do you want to have this completed by? And make them aware of the deadlines that you are setting for yourself, and also the deadlines that you expect of them. So you may send a chapter to a reviewer and say, here's the draft of my chapter 1. And I highly recommend in that email having a firm recommended deadline for when you expect to see that chapter back. So you may say something like, would it be possible to have this document back to me by October 20th or something like that? And hold them accountable to those deadlines, because in order for you to move forward, you need their feedback. So I know it can be challenging sometimes to give deadlines to your chair or your reviewers, but it's just going to serve you in the end, because it's going to help you keep the process going. And it's important for yourself too. If you know that you are getting a chapter 1 back by a specific date, that's going to help you block off the writing time to address the feedback that they're giving you, and kind of just keep pushing it forward. So have those early conversations with your reviewers. and also become aware of their expectations. So when you start writing your paper, you should ask if the school has a template for the format of the dissertation, or a checklist. That is going to help you make sure that you are including all of the sections that they expect in the final product. You may also ask for a copy of previous students' work. Again, that's just going to help you understand the formatting and make sure you're doing exactly what they expect. If your school does not have any resources like that available, like a template or a checklist, something you may want to do is go on to ProQuest. That's a website. It's just proquest.com, I believe. And that's kind of like a repository of dissertations. So you may want to go to ProQuest, maybe look up your school, and then you can see dissertations from students that have graduated from your school or your department. It's also helpful to look at how people structure their papers based on specific methodologies. So I know personally, if I am writing a paper that's a case study, I might go to ProQuest and look to see how others have done it, just to get ideas on that, how to structure that paper. And then I also recommend getting written feedback from your reviewers. So I have worked with students who they will send their chapter to their reviewer, chapters 1, 2, 3, maybe, and then the reviewer will just send an email maybe with their feedback, or they'll just give them verbal feedback. When possible, I recommend asking your reviewer to actually put comments into your document. It is really challenging to make changes when you don't see what the change is in relation to. So if you can have that reviewer really go through and add those detailed comments in the document and kind of set that expectation early, it's just going to help you reduce the time of going back and forth and making the revisions. So that is a big recommendation I have, is getting that written feedback in your actual document, as opposed to like an email where they say, oh, this looks great, or yeah, I need you to be more specific in the methodology. That is good feedback, but it would be helpful to know exactly what do you need to be more specific on. So, just having that feedback will help you move forward more efficiently. Next, this is kind of a more lighthearted recommendation, but keep perspective. So this is a challenging time during your PhD. It is a long process. And it can be very easy to kind of put your head down and be in your dissertation at all times, but you do need breaks. You are human. You need to live between writing. So I recommend using some positive reinforcement tactics. It is kind of a well-documented strategy to have positive outcomes. So I'll show you all at the end here, a table of evidence, or a timeline that I developed for myself. I recommend after you complete something on your list, so maybe you send off chapter 1 to be reviewed, treat yourself a little bit, or have a moment to take a break, an intentional break from the writing, so that you can, sustain the process. It's easy to get burned out if you don't take these breaks. So just remember to take breaks for yourself, and also seek support. So when you're writing, if you don't know where to start, or if you are stuck on a particular area, that is when you should be reaching out to your reviewers, to your peers, or to your library. And sometimes it just helps to talk it out with somebody, just to bounce ideas back and forth. I know for myself, there are many times that I have sat down to write and I'm just kind of stumped, and I just need to talk to like a classmate and kind of just talk through what's going on in my mind and where I'm stumped. The best way to get to a rewrite is to first put something down. So, don't let kind of a perfection mindset stop you from getting those initial thoughts down. Even if what you put down on paper is, a mess or it's fragmented, just having that down is going to help you move forward and develop it into something that that can go into your manuscript. So get those ideas down and bounce them off of people when you can. And then when possible, so, you know, a lot of what I've talked about today is ways to cut down the time. So using a citation manager, establishing a review process timeline with your reviewers so that you know how long everything's going to take. Other ways that you might want to cut down time are to just delegate tasks. So you may want to hire a statistician or a consultant, an APA editor, or a transcriptionist. So if you are maybe less familiar with statistics and you're just not sure the proper methodology or the proper test to run, or even something as simple as not being sure how to write a certain chapter in your paper, we are here to help with that. Statistics Solutions here, we do help with dissertation editing and consulting. So it can be helpful to have that resource at your ready. If you just need help kind of moving forward, or you need guidance on how to write the methodology or what methods to use, or drafting your results, whatever it may be. APA editing is also something that I think that can be a big time suck, is going through and making sure your page numbers are correct and making sure your front matter, your table of contents, all of those things. It sounds not complicated, or it sounds easy, but it's part of your time. So those are some things that you may be able to delegate out and have completed on your behalf. Also, if you are doing a qualitative study, where you are going to be interviewing participants and maybe recording those, you're going to need to get those transcribed in order to analyze that data. So you can yourself listen to the recordings and transcribe them yourself, or if that's somewhere that you feel that time would be better served somewhere else, you may want to send your transcriptions out to, send your recordings out to be transcribed for you so that you can really focus on the writing. So these are just some little things. And, as you work on your own studies, I am sure you'll identify sticking points where you think, oh, I think somebody else could do this for me. Maybe that's going to be in your recruitment, maybe at distributing flyers. That may be something where you can have like an undergraduate or graduate research assistant help you out with handing out flyers. Another one that I think is a good place to cut down your effort is screening participants for eligibility. So if you're able to get an undergraduate or graduate volunteer research assistant, or funded if you have funding for your research, you can train them and you can have them help with screening participants, making sure that they're eligible for your study. So all of those things are, kind of things that you may be able to delegate. And I'm going to put this in here as well on the screen. I see there are a few questions about hiring a statistician. So here at Statistics Solutions, we do full service consulting and editing for both qualitative, quantitative, and we also do mixed methods dissertations. So we can help with anything from topic development, so really forming those first research questions through each of the chapters, all the way through to your final defense of your dissertation. So if those are some services that you think may be helpful to you, we do provide those, and we provide a 30-minute complimentary consultation. So if you're like, I don't know where to start, or I don't know how you can best help me, maybe that 30-minute consultation will help you and us identify the areas that we can best help with. But before we end here, there are a few other resources I want to share. So I'm gonna switch my screen, and I will also open the chat up for question and answer. So I'll go through your questions now.